Greetings, Earthlings. Welcome back to my channel, and today we are going to be talking about Doctor Who and gender trouble. But first, we have to answer the question, what is gender trouble? Gender trouble is a term coined by academic Judith Butler in the late 20th century in her book of the same title. It is essentially the idea that what us humans call gendered behavior is actually not inherent to any individual, but instead is developed through socialization in the heterosexual matrix. People who diverge from the stereotypical behavior attributed to their assigned gender cause what Butler refers to as gender trouble, which challenges the idea of certain traits being inherent to specific genders. We can use the concept of gender trouble to examine mostly sexist, homophobic, and transphobic ideas. It allows us to critique gender essentialist rhetoric and analyze how society not only encourages certain behavior in certain genders, but also ascribes different characteristics to people based on their perceived sex. This concept, the idea of giving different names to the same behavior based on which gender is performing said behavior, is talked about extensively in the book Invisible Women: Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Caroline Criado Perez. I think it fits in very well with the concept of gender trouble, because when women break the boundaries of their sex and act in a stereotypically masculine manner, they are usually described more negatively compared to their male counterparts, who are described positively while exhibiting the same behavior. How gender develops internally and how it is perceived externally affect not only how a person navigates the world around them, but also their ability to navigate the world easily. And in my opinion, there is no fictional character who illustrates this idea more than the Doctor. Basically, the TLDR is that this video is going to examine the Doctor's genders, or lack thereof, and how it connects to themes of queerness and rejects gender essentialism by causing gender trouble in a non-traditional sense of the phrase. You might be wondering though, how can you cause gender trouble non-traditionally? Isn't the very concept of gender trouble going against tradition? Well, what I mean by non-traditional gender trouble is that, of course, the Doctor is a fictional character without set gender. The society in which they were raised did not have the same issues as humanity in the sense that they were not subjected to gendered socialization as they grew up. Each Time Lord was allowed to develop their personalities unimpeded by outside forces such as sexism. One might think that this lack of gendered socialization means that there are no sexist stereotypes to rebel against in Time Lord society, therefore rendering the concept of a Time Lord embodying gender trouble impossible. However, the Doctor is a Time Lord who interacts frequently with gendered society, and therefore is subjected to its rules. They might not exhibit any gendered behavior, but they do have gender forced upon them by the beings around them. For example, the Doctor has expressed a distaste for the human concept of gender, claiming Time Lords are beyond such things. The fact that the Doctor refers to themselves as a man or woman, a he or she, seems to me to be something they do to integrate themselves into human society, or to make the people around them, i.e. the companions, more comfortable with their alienness by not seeming too alien. It seems like an attempt at assimilation. They allow humans to gender them and go along with it because it is easier than constantly explaining that they are beyond gender and reject those labels. This is a concept that many transgender and genderqueer people are familiar with, and the parallels speak to an inherent queerness present within the show and the character of the Doctor. The concept of the genderqueer Time Lord is not new. Even back in the 1980s, actors from the show like Patrick Troughton and Tom Baker were advocating for a woman to play the Doctor, introducing the idea that Time Lords are beyond gender very early on. One could even argue that the idea was introduced back in 1996 when William Hartnell's Doctor regenerated into Patrick Troughton and the Doctor was canonized as a shapeshifter. Shapeshifting, especially in the more recent decades, has become a trope through which authors examine genderqueer identities, with it being a crucial avenue for non-binary representation. The potentiality of the body to morph, shift, change, and become fluid is a powerful fantasy in transmodern cinema, and although the cisgender authors of Doctor Who may not be projecting onto the character in such a way, they may have seen the opportunities that such gender fluidity could provide to the show and its audience. Although classic Who does not play with the Doctor's gender often, if at all, modern Who, or New Who, is a different story. The first hint of Time Lords being able to change gender comes in the episode The 11th Hour, in which the 11th Doctor pulls at his hair and exclaims, "I'm a girl!" In a later episode, he remarks that the Corsair, a fellow Time Lord, didn't feel like himself unless he had an Ouroboros tattoo, or herself a couple of times. There were a few more offhanded comments like this that persisted until the reintroduction of the Master in Series 8, although she was reintroduced as Missy due to her feminine appearance. It wasn't until 2017, though, that it was announced the next Doctor, the 13th Doctor, would be played by a woman. This decision proved to be divisive. On one hand, you had women celebrating a new era of representation, and on the other, you had men bemoaning the loss of a male role model. "The Doctor can't be a woman," the men cried, and the woman replied back, "But why not?" The answer was simple, because the men viewed the Doctor not as a gender-fluid alien, but as a man. They viewed the Doctor through that static, narrow lens and could not comprehend that a new female face did not mean a complete fundamental reset of the Doctor as a whole. They assumed that the female Doctor would act more feminine, which was apparently an unforgivable sin. But even when Series 11 came out and proved that the Doctor's core personality hadn't changed, people still claimed it had because they viewed the Doctor differently now. And that is how the Doctor embodies the term gender trouble. Because not only do they cause it within their own fictional universe, they cause gender trouble outside of that universe in the real world, amongst the people who watch or are aware of Doctor Who. There is a strange connection in how characters within the show view the Doctor and how people in the real world view them. For example, in the show, with their new female appearance, the Doctor sometimes struggles to command a room as they once did. This is not because they are suddenly a meek, shy woman, but because the men around them view them as lesser now, and not worthy of their attention. This writing decision is realistic and reflects the world we live in today, but it also has the unintended effect of bolstering the misogynists. They, whether on purpose or unintentionally, misinterpret these scenes as the Doctor not having the capacity to be authoritative, instead of having her authority ignored due to bigotry. It is a vicious cycle. The writers attempt to showcase sexism by having characters react to the Doctor in a certain way, and the bigots at home end up perpetuating that sexism by ignoring what those interactions are saying about society, and instead claiming them as proof that the Doctor has fundamentally changed for the worse. However, I think Doctor Who actually does an excellent job of not changing the Doctor too much. The Doctor's personality does change ever so slightly, as is the norm with regeneration, but the core traits remain. The masculine traits that people associated with the masculine Doctors remain, meaning they aren't inherent to men. The feminine traits that people came to associate with the feminine Doctor remain from before, meaning that they had always been there, even when the Doctor looked like a man. Even the Doctor's sexuality, which I believe to be either bisexual or omnisexual, does not change. The new feminine Doctor still expresses a desire to be romantically involved with women, and although she doesn't express an interest in men, we can assume it's there because of the fact that the two Doctors who follow her are interested in men, and there are hints that her predecessors were also romantically inclined toward men as well. Some previous Doctors have freely flirted across gender lines, like the 10th Doctor in the episode The Shakespeare Code, and the 11th Doctor also made mention of having had romantic entanglements with androids, admitting to having created a boyfriend for himself. While the Doctor's sexuality is not contingent on what gender they currently appear as, I thought it was worth mentioning because the Doctor's sexuality was of course going to be a point of contention with each gender swap. Fans who subscribed to a more heteronormative worldview expected the new female Doctor to only like men, since her male predecessors were only given female love interests, whereas fans who were less in tune with the heterosexual matrix correctly expected no change in sexuality. Gender and sexuality can be linked and can affect each other, but in this case they do not seem to do so, because, again, the Doctor has no set gender. Though their body is constantly changing, their core personality traits remain the same. Why would that not also apply to sexuality? I do feel the need to address the character of Missy, or the Master. Their character was the first Time Lord on screen to swap genders in 2014, going from being played by a man in their previous appearances to being played by a woman. Unlike the Doctor, whose personality did not change drastically, the Master went from a more composed, serious, and professional demeanor, one that was stereotypically masculine, to a more salacious personality, along with an ultra-feminine appearance. Fan reactions to Missy being revealed as the Master were generally much more benevolent than fan reactions to a female Doctor, and I believe that this shift in personality attributed to those positive reactions. Not to mention that Michelle Gomez was given a chance to prove her acting chops before the gender swap reveal was made, which Jodie Whittaker did not get. She was announced as the Doctor long before she appeared as the Doctor on the show. Missy's character has been criticized for being too pantomime, too egregiously feminine, or too unlike her previous incarnations. One fan said in his review of the show, "The Master is now permanently branded a woman, and because of this change in appearance, has shifted characteristics to be more like a woman. It has affected the Master and the Doctor's relationship and made it almost unbearable to watch because what was once a love-hate brotherly relationship is now a flirt-off. Both of the characters have now kissed each other, and I am left wondering why. It goes against their previous chemistry together, and it appears to me that just because one of them is now female, that means it's okay to add in sexual tension." This is a completely valid and understandable issue to have with the Master's gender swap. Her feminine appearance and seductive personality, to me, though, is not an indication that gender and its associated stereotypes apply to Time Lords. Instead, it speaks to the biases of the writers of the show, specifically Stephen Moffat. Why did the Master need to change their name to accommodate their new appearance? Why were they suddenly in love with the Doctor? And why did they seem to be performing femininity to a degree which was almost excessive and seemed to be almost a mockery of the gender itself? Moffat and his team of writers could have gone down this avenue on purpose, using Missy's gleeful performance of gender as commentary on how all gender is a performance to different degrees, especially for Time Lords. To me, it seems that Missy is simply putting on a show, embracing stereotypes and leaning into them because she thinks it's amusing and that she can use her femininity to her advantage. And that is absolutely something the Master would do. Okay, now back to the Doctor. There are a few episodes of the show in which the problems that come with the gender swap are explored, but aside from the Witchfinders, it's mostly in the background and not the main point of the episode. Most moments addressing the gender swap are throwaway comments that are often used for comedic effect, like when the Doctor says, "Come to Daddy, I mean Mummy," in the Ghost Monument, or when the Doctor says, "I never did this while I was a man," in Demons of the Punjab. There are also moments where other characters, usually men who were previously aware of the Doctor, presume that her older male companion, Graham, is the Doctor because he appears male, and they associate masculinity with the Doctor. Even Jack Harkness, the omnisexual space rogue, assumes that Graham is the Doctor when he first meets him, excitedly kissing him on the mouth. I think it's worth pointing out these things because the show does not address the Doctor's change in gender unless they are deliberately pointing out how things have changed for them socially or as a joke. And when they do address the social changes, those moments are few and far between. Ultimately, it seems the writers mostly wrote the character as if their gender had not swapped, only addressing the change on occasion when it suited the story being told, like in The Witchfinders. But this is probably the best decision they could have made with the character, and personally, I was very happy with the portrayal of the 13th Doctor's gender. I thought that largely ignoring the change, except for the moments where they address how people's views on the Doctor shifted, was brilliant, and really helped sell that the Doctor was the same person. And like I mentioned earlier, her behavior, although it changes slightly, ultimately remains very similar to her previous selves. She has a warmer and more inviting presence than her predecessor, the 12th Doctor, but she is also a lot more emotionally constipated and has a hard time acknowledging when something is wrong. So she became more feminine in some ways, but more masculine in others. So the changes made to her were not like the changes made to the Master, where all the new traits were stereotypically feminine. But why is keeping the Doctor gender neutral, genderless, or genderqueer so important? Why is it problematic to put them into boxes of male or female? Well, according to Deyaratna, seeing a character that cares very little about their gender, about how they present themselves, ultimately helps break down the gender norms. It normalizes being outside of the gender box. Especially with the Doctor, who is by definition gender fluid, it makes sense to depict them as such. It helps to normalize non-binary identities in a unique and creative way. Non-binary characters, when positioned as central, capable, and self-determined in media, offer models of empowerment in depicting gender complexity. The Doctor is depicted as all three of those things: central, capable, and self-determined, and I would certainly say this results in them being a source of empowerment for transgender individuals in the fandom. Russell T Davies likes to tout himself as this giver of representation for marginalized communities, but I would argue that Chris Chibnall did more for the trans community by curating and exploring a Doctor who broke down gender walls. And trans people are not the only people who benefit from this eschewing of gender norms and labels. Cis people benefit as well, because cis people also do not neatly fit into the gender boxes created by society. Women can be tall, muscular, and hairy, while men can be short, graceful, and have high-pitched voices. There have been reported incidents where cis women were barred from using a bathroom because they appeared too masculine and were assumed to be trans. No physical attribute or behavior is specific to one gender, no matter how many people preach otherwise. Intersex people, who are born as neither male nor female, all fall under the trans umbrella by default, as society does not typically recognize their birth gender as valid. They are often forced to live as if they were cisgender, and often are not even told they are intersex, instead having their genitals mutilated as children to ascribe to a more cisgender way of living, which in a society where non-binary is normalized and accepted, would not happen. Showcasing non-binary and gender-conforming characters in media serves not only to empower those who share those identities, but it also helps to normalize those identities for others who might not interact with those types of people on a daily basis. This, in turn, decreases instances of discrimination and bigotry in everyday life. It provides insight into the lives of marginalized individuals and is a way of advocating for those groups. It humanizes them, which, it's kind of sad that we have to humanize humans to other humans, but it's important work that those with social privilege have a responsibility to do. Thankfully, this is something that the writers of Doctor Who seem to understand, and they do their best to give us, the audience, that representation. It's not always perfect, but nothing is, so I can excuse that. The important thing is that they are trying. And that is all I have to say on the Doctor's gender. Thank you so much for listening if you are still here, and I hope that when you go to bed tonight, your pillow is cold on both sides. Bye-bye.